Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and today is part 3 of the Texan Revolution. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. In part 2 of the Texan Revolution, I explained that following the surprisingly rapid defeat of all Mexican forces in Texas, the rebels presumed that Santa Anna would not arrive with an army until the spring. Therefore, they had plenty of time to debate a constitution and to build an army from recruits attracted by an offer of free land. However, Santa Anna moved much faster than expected and appeared in front of the Alamo on February 23rd. Jim Bowie, the senior officer in the Alamo's garrison, had fallen ill, so the inexperienced William Travis found himself in charge and decided to defend the Alamo rather than retreat. Travis hoped that Sam Houston would lead the Texan army to save the garrison, but Houston believed that Travis had exaggerated the danger, and anyway, he had no army. Eager for a glorious, bloody victory to strengthen his reputation, Santa Anna launched a frontal assault on March 5th. Hundreds of Mexican soldiers died, but almost all of the garrison was killed in the savage fighting, and the few survivors were executed as a warning to the rest of the rebels. Within a week of the Alamo's capture, Santa Anna had set his strategy for the next stage of the campaign. General Canoa would move north towards Camino Real. General Ramirez y Sesma would advance into the heart of the Anglo colonies, and General Urrea was given the southern approach through Goliad, and all three prongs were to meet at San Felipe. Houston had become commander of the army on March 4th, but instead of fighting Santa Anna's army directly, he wanted to lure the Mexicans deeper into East Texas and weaken them with guerrilla warfare while hoping that the U.S. would intervene, which was exactly what Santa Anna dreaded. Arriving at Gonzales on March 11th to find less than 200 men waiting, Houston learned that the Alamo had fallen, so he ordered James Fannin to abandon Goliad and fall back to the Guadalupe River. As one of the few semi-professional soldiers among the rebels, Fannin would have been expected to follow the clear orders from Houston, but he didn't. With a garrison of 400 men, a safe water supply, and cannon-proof walls, Goliad could probably have been held indefinitely, so Fannin was naturally tempted to stay and fight. Actually, it did not really matter whether he retreated or stayed, as long as he started preparing immediately, but he could not make up his mind until it was made up for him when Urrea's troops arrived on March 18th. The rebels were able to slip out the next morning under the cover of fog, strangely dismissing the threat of the Mexican troops who he was retreating from. Fannin decided to halt in an open field in sight of Colito Creek Forest, which offered cover and a water supply. Surprised by the sudden appearance of Mexican cavalry, Fannin got his troops moving towards the safety of the forest, but the cavalry easily cut them off. Forming a square, the rebels held off the Mexicans until nightfall. The men could have escaped in the darkness, but Fannin refused to leave the wounded. The arrival of Urrea's artillery ended any hope of fighting, so the rebels surrendered the next morning. Unknown to the prisoners, Urrea was negotiating with Santa Anna to spare their lives. He had a total of 500 prisoners, including 82 volunteers from New York who had been caught a few days earlier when they landed at Copano. Fed up with Urrea's pesky fixation with human rights, Santa Anna sent a direct order to Colonel Jose Portilla, the officer in charge of the prisoners, who had them all executed on March 27th. Among Fannin's men were the 60 men of the Alabama Red Rovers, which had been mainly recruited from the small town of Cortland, Alabama, so Cortland lost most of its young men that day. A number of men were spared, either skilled laborers or doctors, and a few were saved by the wives of Mexican officers. Susanna Dickinson, her daughter, and Travis's slave Joe arrived at Gonzales on March 13th with Santa Anna's manservant Ben, who gave Santa Anna's proclamation to Houston, and it did not take long before everyone knew that no quarter would be given. Houston immediately ordered his troops to retreat, but much of his little army was made up of colonists, so the situation went from dangerous to catastrophic when large numbers of men left to protect their families, and many of the mercenaries who had come in hope of land also deserted. So his army shrank from a peak of 1,400 men to 400 to 500 men. Like almost everyone else in Texas, Houston had been caught off guard by the sudden arrival of the Mexican army, but he was not initially concerned because he thought that he had an army. He simply needed to pull in the scattered units. Following the slaughter of the Alamo's garrison, the destruction of the Matamoros expedition, and the capture and execution of Goliad's garrison in less than 3 weeks, Houston was head of a basically non-existent army. The original plan of digging in along the Guadalupe River was exchanged for a simpler plan, namely, retreat as fast and as far as possible from the advancing Mexican army. All across Texas, columns of refugees fled Santa Anna's army, leaving a trail of abandoned goods and homes in what came to be known as the Runaway Scrape. Despite steady criticism from the newly elected president, his senior officers, and pretty much everyone else, Houston led his army east towards Louisiana in the hope of dragging the American army into the rebellion. As a protege of President Andrew Jackson, Houston knew that Jackson wanted an excuse to intervene, but it had to have a legal basis. Jackson refused to officially recognize the rebels because it would mean war with Mexico, not because he feared Mexico, but because it would give Britain, France, and Spain the opportunity to interfere. However, he had sent General Edmund Pendleton Gaines, who shared Jackson's belief that the best defense was an offense, to command the troops in West Louisiana on the border with Texas. While his orders stressed the neutrality of the U.S., Gaines was also told to prevent Indian raids into Mexico, which was simply a cover for a possible invasion of Mexico, since the Mexican army was able to deal with any such raids on its own. Messages took a week to travel from Washington to the frontier, and a lot could happen in a week, so Jackson had plausible deniability. Gaines prepared carefully by calling out all of the militias near the region in order to build up his force to an army of 8,000 to 12,000 soldiers, which would have only one purpose: the invasion of Mexico. As justification for requesting 2 to 3 battalions of militia each from Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee, Gaines claimed that a Mexican agent was stirring up trouble among the Caddo Indians who were on the other side of the Sabine River. Actually, the Caddos were convinced that the rebels would kill them, so they had all fled, which was very inconvenient for Gaines. In the end, the governors of Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi dismissed Gaines' request as part of a scam to help Texan land speculators and refused to send troops. Believing that his army could only handle one battle, Houston continued to lure the Mexican army east, further from their supplies and closer to Gaines. This caution was understandable, since risking a battle against an enemy who killed all prisoners was suicidal, unless you knew that you would win. Moreover, he realized that even if his men won the first battle, there were still several other armies waiting under Generals Genoa, Urrea, and Santa Anna. A large number of Gaines' troops, the number is debatable, but estimates range from less than 100 to several hundred men, did desert in uniform to Houston's army, and they were later allowed to return without any questions being asked. Having outpaced the Mexicans, Houston used the time to drill the men. The situation improved on April 13th when he received 2 cannons that had been forged in Cincinnati and were immediately named the Twin Sisters. Unknown to Houston, he would be aided by Santa Anna's fixation with glory and addiction to risks. Convinced that the rebellion was almost completely crushed, Santa Anna worried about maintaining his hold on power in Mexico City. Since General Jose Urrea was getting all of the fame, he needed to inflict the final defeat. Leaving the main army behind, Santa Anna pressed on with the 750 men of the vanguard to cut off Houston. At the same time, Houston knew that he could continue towards Nacogdoches, where the U.S. troops were, or go to Harrisburg and meet Santa Anna head-on. Actually, he had no choice. The men burned with the desire to avenge the massacres at the Alamo and Goliad, so they would have mutinied if he had retreated. Several accounts state that the men at the front of the column simply made the decision for him by turning right towards Harrisburg instead of waiting for orders. Once he knew that he had to fight, Houston pushed his men hard in order to reach his preferred battlefield. He had picked an area blocked on both sides by swamps with the San Jacinto River at the rear, so that retreat was impossible, and he then concealed his army of 800 men in the forest to wait for Santa Anna, who arrived on April 20th. After a short artillery duel, Santa Anna's sole cannon was destroyed, but Houston still refused to let his men charge, hoping that the Mexicans could be lured into a rash attack. Fortunately for Houston, Santa Anna had his men camp with Peggy Lake behind them so they could not retreat, although his long-suffering senior officers were far from happy with this situation. Admittedly, 400 reinforcements arrived the next day, but they were raw recruits. The night and the next morning passed without any movement by the rebels, so the Mexican troops had a nice siesta after the noon meal, believing that no sane person would dare cross in broad daylight the 500 yards of exposed area that separated the forest from the camp. The Mexicans were exhausted because they had marched all day and spent much of the night building defenses. Meanwhile, the rebels were in the cool shade of the forest, burning with the desire to fight. Moving off at 4 p.m., the rebels were not noticed by the sleeping Mexican army because no guards had been posted, so the army was able to march across the field unseen. Houston and his officers were able to ensure that his men waited until they were 40 yards away from the Mexican camp before firing. When the Texans' 2 cannon ripped through the slumbering Mexicans, the rebels charged like demons. The Mexicans must have thought that they had woken up in hell, but they fought back, and Houston had 2 horses shot out from under him. After a cannon blew open a hole in the Mexican defenses, the rebels poured into the camp screaming, "Remember Goliad! Remember the Alamo!" At that point, Mexican troops started dropping their weapons and running away. Attempts at surrender proved futile, and the slaughter of unarmed Mexican troops lasted for several hours. In the end, 9 rebels and 630 Mexicans died, but a total of 730 prisoners were still alive at the end of the day. Captured 7 miles from the camp, Santa Anna was spared by Houston to everyone's surprise. Most likely, Houston was worried that the rest of the Mexican army could easily destroy his exhausted troops, so Santa Anna was given an offer he could not refuse. Order his army to leave Texas in exchange for his life. After considering the matter carefully, Santa Anna signed the treaties of Velasco on May 1st, which were illegal according to international law since they were signed under duress, but Santa Anna could not go back on his own signature. Disgusted by the order to retreat, Santa Anna's officers wanted to reject it, but his second-in-command, General Filisola, obeyed the order. He had been chosen as second-in-command by Santa Anna because his loyalty ensured that he would not be a threat. Filisola did not care about Texas, could barely feed his army, and worried that the Texans would butcher the prisoners. Events proved Filisola correct. When the Mexican army retreated, endless rain turned the roads into a sea of mud, destroying their ammunition and rusting their muskets, while many soldiers became sick with dysentery and died. Despite this astonishing victory, the situation was still dangerous. While the Mexican army had left Texas, it could easily return. In fact, a campaign to retake Texas seemed likely, since the Mexican government refused to accept the treaty or recognize the Republic of Texas. General Urrea gathered an army at Matamoros, but volunteers continued to revive in Texas after the Battle of San Jacinto, swelling the Texan army. In the end, Urrea's army was needed to deal with other revolts against the centralist government in Mexico City, so the young republic would survive long enough to be annexed by the United States. Except the annexation did not proceed according to plan. Houston had won the presidency by an overwhelming margin and was eager to work with his former mentor to iron out the annexation details. However, the struggle between the abolitionists and the slave owners was heating up in the U.S., where former President John Quincy Adams, currently a member of Congress, led the battle to prevent the admission of another slave state to the Union. Jackson and Adams genuinely hated each other. So Jackson would have happily embraced the battle, but his second term was almost finished, and his successor, Martin Van Buren, lacked Jackson's popularity. Therefore, he was unwilling to risk such a divisive conflict, so the Texans were stunned to learn that their application to enter the Union had been denied. Instead, Texas would have to navigate an uncertain future as an independent republic. That's the Texan Revolution. Thanks for listening.